The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above the third floor of Sacred Heart, the same song they'd hummed 6 days a week for the past 72 months. Elena Martinez heard it the way most people heard their heartbeat, constant, invisible, a rhythmic reminder that you were still alive. She refilled the 4 bags in Bay 7 with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory, her scrubs pressed into sharp creases despite the July heat that pressed against the hospital windows like something with weight. Her hands moved in practiced arcs, fingers steady as surgical steel, the movements of someone who had done this 10,000 times before and would do it 10,000 times again without a tremor or hesitation. She didn't know that Dr. Hargrove, chief of surgery, had already decided what she was. Furniture. A competent background figure in pressed cotton. The kind of nurse who showed up early and left late and never asked for recognition or weekend coverage. He passed her in the hallway at 1,247 hours without seeing her, didn't see the white scars branching across her inner forearms like frost on a window, didn't see the way her breathing changed when the life flight helicopter passed overhead at 1,300 hours, didn't notice how her fingers continued working through the sound even as her eyes tracked the rotor blades against the ceiling tiles. Inside her locker, 7 floors below where he walked, hung a navy blue jacket with a faded unit patch sewn into the lining. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. The same unit insignia worn by men who'd held Phi Base Dante for 11 straight hours under mortar fire. The same insignia worn by men she'd kept breathing when the morphine ran out. Elena's teenage son didn't know any of this. Marcus thought his mother had always been this way, a civilian nurse with steady hands and early mornings, the kind of woman who made coffee at 5 in the morning and came home with hospital parking lot rain on her shoulders. He didn't know that the woman who helped him with calculus homework at the kitchen table had once held an arterial bleed together with her bare hands while helicopters landed around her. He didn't know she still woke at 0300 hours sometimes, her heart rate climbing without reason, her breathing shallow until she could convince her nervous system that the sound outside was a car backfiring, not incoming fire. Invisibility, she'd learned, was a kind of healing. Sacred Heart's resuscitation bay was a glass-walled cube on the trauma floor, visible to everyone who passed, which meant it was seen by no one at all. The walls were transparent but the message was clear: look through, don't look in. Elena worked the 3rd floor, where they kept the stable patients, the ones who would probably make it home. She didn't work trauma. Trauma worked itself out in those glass boxes while people pretended not to watch. This was intentional. She'd chosen the 3rd floor specifically. No codes on the 3rd floor. No moments where her hands knew things her mouth couldn't explain. No scenarios where she might have to make decisions that would follow her into the parking lot. At 1,402 hours, the ER doors burst open below her with the particular violence of medevac arrival. She heard it from the 3rd floor, the coordinated chaos of a critical incoming, the sharp acoustic signature of a military evacuation. The ER staff moved with controlled urgency, voices cutting through the hum of fluorescent lights like knife blades through water. Elena was restocking for bags in the medication closet when the announcement came through the overhead system. Not the standard code announcement. Something else. Something official. The voice was clipped, military adjacent, incoming critical trauma, 4-star general, Special Forces operation, requesting all available trauma surgeons to resuscitation bay immediately. She stopped moving. Her right hand froze in the act of reaching for another bag of normal saline. The bag crinkled in her grip. The fluorescent lights continued their mechanical hum, they didn't care about rank or military lineage or the specifics of how someone had been injured. The lights hummed the same for generals as for grocery store clerks. Elena's breathing shifted. Not dramatically. No one watching would have noticed. Just a slight deepening, a pause before exhale, the kind of breath control that came from having once had to breathe quietly in a basement while mortar rounds walked their way up a street outside. 20 years. That's how long it had been since Marjah. 20 years of reconstructing herself into someone safer, someone easier to love, someone who didn't wake up screaming at the sound of helicopters. She descended the emergency stairwell. Not the elevator. The stairs felt safer, more control, more awareness of surroundings, something hardwired in her nervous system that preferred vertical passage where she could see above and below simultaneously. Her badge clattered against her sternum as she moved, a small silver rectangle with her name and credential listed in 12-point Times New Roman. Elena Martinez, RN. That was all the hospital knew. That was all anyone needed to know. The stairwell door opened onto the second floor, and she could hear the trauma team assembling below, their voices carrying up through the ventilation system. Hargrove was already in the bay. She could hear his voice, the particular timbre of absolute certainty, the sound of a man who had never been wrong about anything and expected the universe to recognize this fact. She pushed through the second-floor doors and walked toward the glass-walled resuscitation bay like someone pulled by gravity rather than choice. The general was there now, his tactical vest still partially on him, his injuries visible and catastrophic. She recognized him in the same moment his injuries became secondary data. The face. 20 years older, shaped by 2 decades of experience and combat stress, but unmistakably, absolutely, the face of an 8-year-old boy covered in dust and blood and the particular absence of hope that came from understanding you might not survive the next 2 hours. Marjah, 2004. Phi base Dante had collapsed. The IED had pulverized the structure into components that were no longer quite recognizable as a building. She'd been there as a field medic with the Marines, her hand steadier than her hand should have been at 23 years old, when she'd pulled him from the rubble. She'd kept him breathing through a sandstorm evacuation. 37 minutes of manual ventilation through an improvised airway while helicopter rotors beat the air into submission. She'd kept talking to him the whole time, not about rescue or hospitals or chances of survival, but about nothing. About the color of sand. About what his mother probably made for breakfast. About anything that wasn't death. And somehow, through the noise and the blood loss and the structural collapse of a building around them, he'd survived. The boy had become a man. The boy who'd watched his country from the ground had apparently become the kind of soldier who led from the front, the kind of warrior who earned stars on his shoulder. Dr. Hargrove's voice cut through the bay like a laser. No surgical intervention viable. Traumatic brain injury, catastrophic spinal damage, approximately 7 to 8 liters of blood loss already, we're looking at exsanguination within the hour. Make him comfortable. Get the family into the consultation room. His hands gestured with the precision of someone accustomed to having his directives become reality. The trauma team moved accordingly. 2 nurses positioned themselves at the bedside, 1 respiratory tech adjusted the ventilator settings, another nurse drew labs. The efficiency was real. The competence was real. The certainty was absolute and final. The general had perhaps 50 minutes before Hargrove's assessment became truth. Elena's clipboard fell to the tile floor with a specific acoustic signature, plastic backing, paper contents, a sound like failure registered in physics. Her hands were steady. Her face didn't change. But her lungs had temporarily forgotten their job. She stood at the glass wall of the bay like someone looking through an aquarium at something drowning. The general's eyes moved. They found her. And for one moment, just a fraction of a second, his pupils focused on her face across the room, through the glass, and something in his expression shifted. Not recognition, perhaps. Not yet. But something. Some echo of a memory from 2 decades ago, some part of his brain that remembered the hands that had kept him alive when he was young enough that survival felt impossible. She turned away. She had to turn away. She was a floor nurse, a 3rd-floor fixture with invisible scars. She was not the person who could help him. She was definitely not the person who should have been watching him through that glass wall with the kind of look in her eyes that suggested she knew something everyone else in that room didn't understand. Dr. Hargrove stood at the center of the resuscitation bay, one hand resting on the general's chart, the other gesturing toward the ventilator. Contact his command, he said to no one in particular. Inform them of the assessment. Within the hour. Comfortable. He spoke like someone delivering a final diagnosis that required no second opinion, because his opinion was the only one that mattered. Elena walked back toward the stairwell. Her legs moved with the precise control of someone who had learned not to run from crisis, because running signaled panic, and panic in field conditions got people killed. She climbed the stairs. The echo of her footsteps followed her up the concrete shaft. Behind her, below her, inside that glass-walled cube, a man she'd saved 20 years ago was being told he couldn't be saved. And she was ascending toward the third floor, back toward the 4 bags and the stable patients and the carefully constructed life in which she was invisible, competent, and completely, utterly powerless to change the trajectory of someone who'd become a 4-star general in the Special Forces. The fluorescent lights on the 3rd floor hummed their mechanical song as she returned. They didn't care about recognition or rank or the weight of history pressing against a nurse's chest. They hummed the same for everyone. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she already knew what she was going to do. Somewhere in the architecture of her nervous system, in the patterns established by 2 decades of training she'd never formally acknowledge, the decision had already been made. She just didn't know it yet. The trauma bay fell silent when Elena stepped forward. Glass walls surrounded the resuscitation space like an aquarium, and beyond them, the general's family watched, his wife in a dark suit, 2 officers in dress blues, their faces carved from granite. On the monitors, the numbers told the story. Bilateral pulmonary contusions. Grade 4 liver laceration. Pelvic fracture with retroperitoneal bleeding. Dr. Hargrove stood at the head of the bed, his starched white coat pristine, his voice flat as a scanner reading vital signs, unsalvageable within 60 minutes. We make him comfortable. That's protocol. Elena had been a floor nurse at Sacred Heart for 6 years. She had held the hands of people dying in ways that medical textbooks couldn't prepare you for. She had learned field trauma protocols in a language of sand and blood and desperation that Dr. Hargrove's credential frame on the wall would never teach him. She took 1 step forward. Her voice didn't waver. Doctor, I've seen this injury pattern before. If we use a modified damage control approach, thoracic stabilization first, then phased hypothermia to buy time for the liver repair. Hargrove's hand went up like a stop sign. He didn't even turn to face her. He turned to the residents instead, his voice dripping with the condescension of a man who had never once questioned the architecture of his own authority. This is why we have protocols. When nurses start playing surgeon, people die. He pivoted toward Elena, and his eyes, pale blue, utterly certain, locked onto hers like a weapon sight. Martinez, you're a floor nurse. Your job is to fetch supplies and empty bedpans, not second-guess trauma surgeons. 1 resident looked at his shoes. Another shifted his weight. The silence in the trauma bay became a texture, something you could feel against your skin. Through the glass, the general's wife watched her husband's pulse drop on the monitor. She watched the exchange in the bay. She saw the way Hargrove dismissed Elena without listening, without even the courtesy of consideration. She turned to the officers beside her. One of them was already writing something down. Elena took 1 measured breath. In that breath was 6 years of being called just a nurse. It was the memory of a child's hand in hers in a collapsed building in Marjah, the same small hand that now lay on a trauma stretcher in Savannah, grown into a man who had chosen to bleed for his country. It was the weight of field protocols she could never claim to know, the weight of 18 lives saved under fire that she had never told anyone about, not even her own sister. It was the knowledge that this man, Hargrove, with his pristine coat and his ironclad certainty, had never kept anyone alive with less than a full surgical suite and a team of residents to absorb his mistakes. 1 tear slid down her cheek. She didn't blink. She didn't look away. She wiped it with the back of her hand, her jaw moving as if processing something only she could hear. I've kept better men than you alive with less than what's in that room. The words landed like a stone dropping into still water. Dr. Hargrove's face darkened, the color rising from his collar upward like a thermometer. He wasn't used to being spoken to this way. Power, real power, the kind Hargrove possessed, had trained him to expect deference, especially from floor nurses who earned a fraction of his salary and had none of his credentials framed on a wall. "Get out of my trauma bay," he said. Elena turned and walked out. The pneumatic door hissed shut behind her like a closing mouth. 2 hours later, she sat in the break room. The sandwich in front of her was turkey and Swiss, purchased from the vending machine downstairs, and she hadn't taken a bite. Her hands were steady on the table. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with their endless, anonymous drone. 3 nurses entered through the door, Chen, Rodriguez, and Vasquez, all people who had worked alongside Elena for months, who had borrowed her extra pens and complained about their own shifts in the way that staff do. They saw her. They exchanged a glance that lasted exactly 2 seconds, the kind of calculation that happens in workplaces when people decide whether association with you is a liability. Then all 3 turned and walked back out the way they came. Elena sat alone with her untouched sandwich. She listened to the break room refrigerator hum. Outside, Savannah's afternoon heat pressed against the windows like something alive. At 1,630 hours, she walked past the unit board. The formal write-up was posted where everyone could see it, laminated and official, and it bore her name in Arial font, size 12. The words were precise, professional, damning. RN Martinez cited for overstepping scope of practice, questioning physician authority in front of patient family, and demonstrating delusional competence. Formal reprimand on file effective immediately. 2 CNAs stood reading it. One of them whispered something to the other. They didn't look at Elena as she passed. In the hallway that evening, Hargrove came around the corner moving with the stride of a man who had just won something. His smile was small and satisfied. He passed Elena and his voice was low, pitched just for her, the tone you use when you're delivering a knife and want no one else to see the blade. "I hope your delusions were worth it, Nightingale." She didn't respond. She watched him walk past, his shoes clicking against the tile floor with the rhythm of someone who had never had to learn the sound of approaching footsteps, who had never had to know when to move and when to go quiet and when to recognize danger by the change in air pressure alone. But that wasn't the worst part. The general had stabilized by 1900 hours, not because of any intervention, but because trauma victims sometimes surprise you, because the human body has its own protocols that doctors don't write in manuals. Hargrove had moved him to the ICU anyway, 3 floors up, where he maintained personal oversight. The orders were explicit, conservative management only. No experimental interventions. No deviation from protocol. And Elena was reassigned to pediatrics, effective immediately. A floor nurse doesn't question this kind of decision. A floor nurse goes where she's told. At 2300, Elena didn't leave. She sat in her car in the parking garage, her hands on the steering wheel, watching the 3rd-floor windows of Sacred Heart Hospital glow against the darkness. The space smelled like vinyl and old coffee from the cup holder, and through the windshield, Savannah's summer air hung thick as a held breath. Her phone buzzed. A text from her 14-year-old son, "When are you coming home?" She didn't answer. At her apartment, her sister was waiting, having watched the boy as she often did, having learned long ago not to ask questions about Elena's extended shifts. At the hospital, Dr. Hargrove issued his final instruction to the charge nurse: if Martinez was seen on the ICU floor, it was immediate termination. Not a discussion. Not a meeting with HR, termination. Elena waited in the stairwell on the 3rd floor. She stood in the concrete space between floors, listening to the electronic chatter of monitors through the closed door, the beeping patterns of machines keeping people alive. At 0147, an alarm sounded. A different frequency. A code alarm. At 0153, she heard the call over the intercom, code blue, ICU Bay 7. Tension pneumothorax. All available personnel. His lung had collapsed. The kind of collapse that kills you in 4 minutes if it isn't addressed. The kind of collapse that Elena had learned to recognize by the sound a monitor makes when a man is dying in front of you. The on-call surgeon was trapped in traffic, ETA 20 minutes. Maybe more. Hargrove would try to manage it conservatively, try to buy time with oxygen and prayer, but oxygen doesn't solve a collapsed lung. You need a needle. You need the skill to place it exactly at the 2nd intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, through the chest wall to decompress the pleural cavity and let the lung re-expand. Elena moved toward the ICU. The charge nurse, Martinez, saw her coming and stepped forward, her face already warning, "Elena, don't. Hargrove will destroy you." Elena didn't slow. She moved with the kind of calm that comes from having already lost everything that could be taken today. The nurse grabbed her arm. Elena's hand came up, not aggressive, just a gentle pressure that was also somehow a command, and the charge nurse released her. At the trauma room door, 2 security guards stood posted, Hargrove's orders, no one enters, no one exits, until the surgeon arrives. Through the glass, Elena could see the general on the stretcher. His oxygen saturation was at 68% and dropping. His heart rate was climbing into the 140s. The monitor showed the sharp peaks and valleys of a man whose body was running out of time. The on-call surgeon was still 17 minutes out. Elena had kept better men than anyone in that room alive with less than what surrounded them now, less equipment, less support, less permission. The general's oxygen saturation climbed to 91% by midnight. Still critical, still requiring constant vigilance, but stable enough that Dr. Hargrove finally authorized transfer to the ICU under his direct oversight. Elena watched from the hallway as the transport team wheeled him past, tubes and lines trailing like the rigging of a ship cutting through dark water. His wife gripped the side rail, knuckles white, eyes hollow with the particular exhaustion that comes from watching someone hover between life and the mercy of machines. The general's face had the waxy appearance of someone already half gone, his breathing synchronized now with the ventilator's mechanical rhythm, in, out, a partnership between flesh and plastic that nobody wanted but everyone needed. Dr. Hargrove stood in the ICU doorway, arms crossed, blocking the entrance like a customs agent at a border. "Immediate family only," he announced to the trauma team. "Everyone else clears the ward. I want no distractions. This patient receives my personal attention until the crisis resolves or until it doesn't." The subtext was a knife. Elena was not family. Elena was not trusted. Elena was the threat that needed to be contained behind locked doors and electronic protocols. She finished her shift at 2,300 hours, clocking out with mechanical precision. Her badge still hung around her neck, worn cotton lanyard, the photo 6 years old, her hair shorter then, her face unmarked by the last year of humiliation. She walked through the parking lot under October rain that hammered the asphalt like machine gun fire, each drop leaving a small crown on impact before collapsing into itself. The Savannah air smelled of wet concrete and diesel from the ambulance bay, the particular combination of clinical detachment and human crisis that clung to her scrubs regardless of whether she scrubbed them clean. But she didn't drive home. She sat in her car, a 2008 Civic with 187,000 miles, paid off 7 years ago, and stared at the hospital's lit windows. The ICU was on the 4th floor, northwest corner. She could see the glow from the nursing station, the quick shadows of staff moving between rooms, the mechanical dance of critical care unfolding behind glass. The rain hammered the windshield. The wipers beat a steady rhythm, keeping time. She thought about the Afghan boy, 8 years old, name she'd learned but never spoken aloud in 12 years, his ribs visible through his shirt like piano keys, his eyes already carrying the weight of a country that didn't believe in childhoods. She'd pulled him from the rubble of Phi Base Dante during the siege, before the evacuation, before the sandstorm grounded the Chinooks, before she realized that sometimes saving a life meant teaching a child how to stop breathing for 30 seconds while you jury-rigged a solution from battlefield garbage. The rain drummed on the roof of the car. She thought about the medical chart she'd glimpsed before Dr. Hargrove reassigned her. Tension pneumothorax. Bilateral contusions on the lungs. Tracheal deviation beginning. The kind of injury that killed quietly, the body's own protective mechanisms becoming its executioners. The kind of injury that required immediate intervention or resulted in a flat line. The kind of injury that could occur again, spontaneously, even after initial stabilization. At 0130 hours, Elena started the car and drove back to the hospital's main entrance. The night shift was skeleton crew, 2 security guards at the front desk studying their phones with the intensity of men who'd already given up on staying awake. She swiped her badge at the employee entrance. The red light held for a moment, then flickered green. She was still a nurse. She was still, technically, allowed to be here. Just not in the ICU. Just not near the general. Just not anywhere near Dr. Hargrove's patient. The corridors at 0135 hours were a different kind of world. The fluorescent panels cast everything in shades of institutional grey. Her footsteps echoed off tile that smelled of bleach and something else beneath it, the faint copper scent of old blood that no amount of cleaning could fully remove. She knew these hallways the way some people knew their own houses, every turn, every exit, every camera angle. 6 years of night shifts had taught her where the blind spots were, where the electronic locks responded faster than others, which corridors the night nurses avoided because they connected to the psychiatric wards holding cells. She took the stairs. Elevators had cameras. The stairwell was concrete and metal railings, the kind of place that echoed with footsteps like a warning. On the 4th floor landing, she paused. Listened. The ICU had a single entrance from the corridor, guarded by a locked door and a proximity reader that required authorized badge access. But the stairwell door itself opened directly into the main hallway, 300 feet from the ICU station. She could see the nurse's desk from here, see the monitors glowing in the darkness, see the young resident who'd refused her earlier sitting with his hands folded, staring at the screens with the gaze of someone who'd already accepted their own powerlessness. Elena moved through the hallway like someone who'd practiced invisibility. Not sneaking, that would draw attention from the cameras. Moving with the confidence of someone who belonged, her shoulders back, her pace steady, her expression the neutral mask of a nurse running a routine midnight errand. She passed a supply closet, a bathroom, a small waiting area with stacked chairs. The ICU door appeared in front of her like a checkpoint, and beyond it, through the reinforced glass window, she could see the general's room. The light inside was dim to the baseline of critical care, enough to see the monitors, not enough to let patients sleep. She could see his face from this angle, turned slightly to the left, his skin the color of old paper. But it was his chest that told her everything. The breathing had changed in the last 2 hours. The rise was faster now, shallower, as if the lungs were working harder to pull in less air. His lips had taken on a faint blue tint that hadn't been there during the transfer. The monitor showed his heart rate climbing, 102, 107, 111, the body's attempt to compensate for something the lungs couldn't deliver. She'd seen this presentation before. Once, in Marjah. Once, in a field surgical unit in Kandahar. Once, in a boarding school in Pakistan where a child had been struck by a car and she'd been the only person with any medical training. The tension pneumothorax was returning. The collapsed lung was re-expanding into pressure. The heart was being crushed by air that should have been outside the body. She looked at the proximity reader. Her badge had worked downstairs. It might work here. It might not. Dr. Hargrove would have blocked her access the moment he'd issued the reassignment order. Hospital administration moved fast when a doctor demanded it. But that wasn't the worst part. The door was locked from the inside, electronic override, controlled from the nursing station. She could see the resident through the window, slumped in his chair, staring at a screen that showed the general's vital signs spiraling toward crisis. The boy, he couldn't have been more than 28, wasn't moving. Wasn't monitoring actively. Was simply bearing witness to a catastrophe in slow motion. Elena approached the nursing station window. The resident looked up, and she watched his expression shift from boredom to recognition to something that looked like fear. She pointed to the trauma room door. She held up 3 fingers, then folded them into her palm, making the gesture clear, 3 minutes. Maybe less. The resident shook his head. Slow, definitive. The shake of a man who'd already been threatened, already been warned, already understood the price of disobedience. Elena turned away from the window. The hallway stretched out behind her, the same way it always did, the same institutional grey, the same hum of machines keeping people alive against odds that weren't always in their favor. She could walk out. She could drive home. She could write a report and send it to administration and file a complaint and let the system handle itself. The system had protocols. The system had procedures. The system had a medical director named Dr. Hargrove who'd already proven that he would burn anyone who challenged his authority. She approached the trauma room door. Through the window, she could see the general's monitor more clearly now. The O2 saturation was dropping. 90%. 88. 85. His chest was working harder, the shallow rapid breathing that meant his body was already suffocating, and every breath was becoming less effective than the last. The wife was gone, moved to the family waiting area, removed from the sight of her husband's crisis by some nurse with more seniority and more authorization to make those decisions. The room was empty except for the machines and the man and the ceiling that suddenly seemed too low. Elena pulled her badge from around her neck. The override reader on the trauma room door was old, installed in the hospital's 2018 upgrade. She'd been part of that retrofit team, back when she'd served briefly as a clinical educator before everything went sideways. She knew that system. Knew the codes. Knew that certain badges, educator badges, supervisor badges, the badge of someone who'd trained other people to save lives, sometimes worked on doors that newer badges couldn't access. The light blinked red. She tried again, holding the badge at a different angle. Red light. Waiting. Red light. A memory moved through her like a current. The Phi-base Dante siege. 18 hours of incoming. The surgical unit running on fumes and prayer and whatever supplies hadn't been destroyed. An Afghan boy brought in, crushed beneath rubble, his chest caving inward, his breathing becoming a wet gurgling sound that meant fluid in the lungs, meant pressure building, meant death in maybe 4 minutes if someone didn't intervene. No chest tubes. No proper equipment. Nothing except a ballpoint pen stripped of its ink, the hollow plastic tube of the shaft, and a pocket knife from her kit. She'd marked the space between his ribs, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the spot where the air was building, the spot where a needle or a tube or a desperate piece of straw could mean the difference between a breath and nothing. She'd pushed through the muscle and the fascia and the pleural membrane, and the pen had hissed as the air escaped, that terrifying whisper of pressure releasing, the boy's body suddenly able to fill again, his color returning from gray to brown, his eyes opening like he was waking from a nightmare that had already killed him once. The general's monitor continued its descent. 82%. 80%. The nurses at the station were probably calling the on-call surgeon, probably notifying Dr. Hargrove, probably activating protocols that would take 12, maybe 15 minutes to reach this room. The boy would be dead in 4. Elena stepped back from the door. The override was too old. Her educator access had probably been revoked the moment she became a problem to Dr. Hargrove. But doors had other ways of opening. Windows had glass. And the trauma room had both. She looked down the hallway. The night nurse was charting at the desk, her attention divided between 3 patients and a stack of paperwork that demanded completion before the shift change. The resident was staring at the monitors with the hollow gaze of someone already writing the death note in his mind. The corridor was quiet except for the machines, the ventilators, and the monitors and the hum of the hospital's perpetual vigil. Elena moved toward the supply room. 3 doors down from the ICU. The kind of room that contained everything from sterile gauze to emergency equipment to the tools that nurses used when other options had been exhausted. She pushed through the door. Her hands moved across the shelves without hesitation, muscle memory from a different life, from a different uniform, from when she'd known exactly what she needed in moments like this. The monitor flatlined at 0200 hours. Elena stood outside Trauma 3, watching through the reinforced glass as the general's chest barely moved. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, but the oxygen saturation numbers told the real story, 64%. 68%. Falling. His heart rate climbed, 142, 156, 168, a desperate drum that couldn't sustain itself much longer. The night resident, a thin-faced third-year named Mitchell, stood at the bedside with his arms crossed, following Dr. Hargrove's standing orders to the letter. Nobody touches that room without authorization. Nobody enters without clearance. The on-call surgeon was 20 minutes out. The general had maybe 8. Elena moved to the locked door and pulled. The electronic mechanism didn't budge. Hargrove had changed the access codes that afternoon, a calculated move to keep her physically separated from this patient. She could feel the seconds evaporating like sweat under her scrubs. Her pulse was steady, but her mind was already 3 steps ahead, running through the trauma protocols she'd executed in field conditions where there was no on-call surgeon, no backup team, nothing but her hands and the will to keep someone breathing. She turned and walked toward the nurse's station, her gait measured, her expression blank. Mitchell watched her go, probably thinking she'd accepted her exile, probably thinking she understood her place in Dr. Hargrove's hierarchy. He had no idea what was about to happen. The night charge nurse, a woman named Sokolov who'd given Elena a sympathetic look in the break room 2 days ago, was charting at the desk. Elena leaned down and spoke quietly, carefully, as though she were asking for a favor instead of issuing a command that bypassed every line of protocol in the hospital's policy manual. Unlock Trauma 3. Now. Sokolov's eyes widened. Elena, I can't. Hargrove said. The general's O2 sat is 64. His heart rate is 168. He's developing tension pneumothorax. I need the door unlocked. That's not my call. Mitchell is the resident on that floor, Anne. Elena straightened. She didn't repeat herself. She didn't plead. She simply turned and walked toward the maintenance station at the far end of the corridor, where the red fire extinguisher hung on the wall beneath a sign that read, "Break glass in emergency." The glass panel protecting it was half an inch thick, reinforced, designed to slow anyone who wasn't actually facing a life-or-death scenario. Elena pulled the extinguisher from its mounting bracket and swung it against the glass. The impact sounded like a rifle shot. The panel cracked, splintered, shattered onto the floor like diamonds. She didn't stop. She pulled the panel away, leaving sharp edges jutting from the frame, and reached through. The lock on Trauma 3 was a standard electronic deadbolt with a manual override, a security feature installed for situations where violent patients needed to be restrained or where the electronic system failed. Her fingers found the override mechanism and twisted it counterclockwise. The door clicked open. An alarm shrieked, a high-pitched wail that made 3 night shift residents look up from their charts. Elena pushed through the door and locked it behind her from the inside, engaging the manual deadbolt. Outside, she heard pounding. She heard Mitchell shouting. She heard security being called. She heard the sound of her own career being systematically dismantled, 1 second at a time. But inside the trauma room, there was only silence and the sound of a dying man's heartbeat climbing toward the ceiling. The general lay on his back, his massive frame dwarfing the ICU bed. His chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular movements, the ventilator fighting against the pressure building inside his pleural cavity. Elena moved to the supply cabinet with the precision of someone who'd done this before, in conditions where there was no margin for hesitation. 14-gauge needle. Catheter kit. Antiseptic prep pads. Her hands didn't shake. She'd held steadier men than this during worse moments than this, and she'd done it with field dressings and will and the muscle memory of someone trained to make impossible choices under impossible pressure. She swabbed the site, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, where the trapped air pressed against his lung and prevented it from expanding. The skin was cold. She found his ribs by touch, counting down from the collarbone, her fingers reading his anatomy the way a musician reads a score. The needle went in at a 90-degree angle, smooth and deliberate, and then came the sound she was listening for, the hiss of air escaping, a sharp exhalation as the pressure decompressed and released its grip on his lung. The general gasped. A real breath. His chest rose fully for the first time in 20 minutes. Elena wrapped the catheter in place with medical tape, securing it, making sure the reinflation was stable. She watched the monitor climb, 72%. 78%. 85%. His heart rate descended from the panic zone, his rhythm stabilizing into something that resembled human instead of animal. She'd done this in a base surrounded by incoming fire. She'd done this in the dark with a flashlight clenched between her teeth. She'd done this for men who'd bled through 3 units of blood and still survived because she'd kept them breathing. The pounding on the door intensified. Security. Multiple voices. She heard Dr. Hargrove's voice beneath the others, a thin rage vibrating through the metal. Get her out. Get her out now. The sound was desperation masquerading as authority. The sound of a man who'd just realized that his hierarchy meant nothing when someone was willing to burn everything to save a life that wasn't supposed to be saved. At 0207, they breached the door with a maintenance key. 2 security guards, both large and both following orders, grabbed Elena's arms and pulled her backward. She didn't resist. Resistance would have changed nothing, and she wasn't here to fight them. She was here because the general needed an 8-minute reprieve, and she'd just given him 18. The on-call surgeon rushed past her into the room, his eyes moving from the monitor to the general's chest to the catheter Elena had placed. He checked the patient's pupils, palpated his abdomen, looked back at the monitor showing steadily climbing oxygen saturation. His voice was barely a whisper. Jesus Christ, you saved him. Dr. Hargrove stood in the hallway, surrounded by night staff who'd emerged from their stations to witness the professional execution about to take place. His face was the color of spoiled meat. He pointed at Elena with a trembling finger. You're done. Security, remove her from the hospital. She's terminated effective immediately. The words were loud enough for everyone to hear. The voice of institutional power exerting itself, trying to reassert dominance over someone who'd just proved that protocols meant nothing against the fundamental obligation to keep people alive. They escorted her through the emergency department, past nurses she'd worked with for 6 years, past residents she'd trained, past the general's wife in the waiting area who reached out and tried to take Elena's hand, but the guards were already moving her forward and the moment was already gone. The wife's face registered recognition, then gratitude, then something like devastation as Elena was removed from the hospital she'd devoted 6 years to serving. In the parking garage, they took her badge and her key card. The ID photo showed a woman who looked almost peaceful, almost content in her anonymity. That woman walked to her car at 0230 in the morning wearing scrubs stained with antiseptic and wearing the weight of a secret that had just become irrelevant because she'd finally stopped hiding. At 0900, her son Jacob found her at the kitchen table in her bathrobe, the coffee cold beside her, her eyes fixed on something far away and invisible. Mom, why are you home early? She had no words for him. No way to explain what she'd done or why she'd done it or why the hospital had decided that following protocol mattered more than saving a life. She sat in the silence of her own undoing and waited for the consequences to arrive. They came 72 hours later. The first 72 hours after Elena locked that trauma room door, Dr. Hargrove moved like a predator circling wounded prey. His office became a war room. He called the board chairman at 0600 on a Tuesday morning, not a request, a summons, and by 0800, for board members had committed to an emergency investigation into Elena's patient files. His voice carried the certainty of a man who had never been told no, smooth as polished mahogany and twice as hard. He contacted her nursing school in Jacksonville, spoke directly to the dean, asked pointed questions about her psychiatric history, her background checks, her character references. He brought in an outside investigator, a woman named Caldwell who specialized in hospital misconduct cases, the kind with 8-figure settlements and sealed NDAs. Caldwell spent 36 hours pulling every chart Elena had touched in 6 years, every medication she'd administered, every procedure note she'd documented. Dr. Hargrove waited like a spider in the center of a web he'd spent 2 decades spinning, convinced that Elena's past contained the ammunition he needed. He didn't know what that past actually was. He was looking for incompetence. He was about to find a legend. Elena sat in her apartment in a converted brownstone on Broughton Street, for blocks from Sacred Heart, and felt the weight of exposure like water filling a room. The night sweats came first. Marjah. Always Marjah. She would wake at 0300 drenched through her sheets, her breath coming in short bursts, her hands already reaching for weapons she didn't carry anymore. The hypervigilance returned like a muscle that had never actually atrophied, just gone dormant. Every car backfire became an IED. Every siren became rotor wash. The sound of her son's skateboard hitting concrete sent her heart into tactical mode, scanning for threats that didn't exist on a tree-lined street in Georgia. She'd spent 18 years running from Marjah, from Phi Base Dante, from the weight of keeping 18 people alive while Charlie Company extracted civilians through a sandstorm so thick it turned day into twilight. She'd chosen this city, this hospital, this quiet life with her boy because anonymity felt like the only treatment that actually worked. Now the past was clawing its way back through the walls she'd built, and there was nothing she could do but wait for the inevitable moment when every secret she'd kept would become hospital gossip, news cycle fodder, the story that consumed her son's entire high school existence. It was Thursday morning at 0900 when her 14-year-old son Marcus found her at the kitchen table in her bathrobe. The sun was already climbing toward noon, and she was still there, surrounded by cold coffee cups and the wreckage of insomnia. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the particular exhaustion that comes from running on no sleep and pure adrenaline for 72 straight hours. Marcus stopped in the doorway, backpack slung over one shoulder, his confusion written across his face like a question mark that didn't have a good answer. "Mom, why are you home early?" he asked, and the innocence in that question almost broke her. She couldn't tell him the truth, that his mother had saved a man's life by smashing through a locked door, that she'd been fired for it, that her entire military past was about to become public property the moment Dr. Hargrove found the right person to leak it to. She couldn't tell him that everything he thought he knew about her was about to change. So she did what she'd been doing since the day he was born, she protected him by staying silent. She managed a smile that fooled neither of them. "Just needed a day off, baby," she said, and turned back to her coffee cup like it contained answers it absolutely did not. The hospital board moved with the efficiency of an institution protecting itself. By the following Monday, Dr. Hargrove's medical license was suspended pending investigation into his treatment of the general, his judgment calls in the trauma bay, and his subsequent removal of a staff member during an active medical crisis. It wasn't revoked, not yet, but suspension meant he couldn't set foot in an OR, couldn't sign orders, couldn't so much as examine a patient. The suspension letter came on hospital letterhead, formal and final as a headstone. He received copies of the investigation findings, his decision to declare the general unsalvageable within 1 hour of arrival, his refusal to implement the needle decompression protocol until it was technically too late, his specific instruction that the trauma room door remain locked and that no floor staff be permitted to intervene. The investigation team noted that these decisions appeared designed to ensure he would be the primary surgeon on the case, that he would receive full credit for the recovery, that no one else could possibly claim a role in the patient's survival. They used words like ego-driven, reckless, and potentially criminal negligence. Within a week, his name had begun to circulate through the surgical networks that spanned from Atlanta to Charleston. Not as the esteemed chief of surgery. As the man who tried to kill a 4-star general by refusing to let anyone else help. His wife filed for separation on Wednesday. His country club revoked his membership on Thursday after a reporter doorstepped the clubhouse asking questions about his conduct. He applied to 17 hospitals across the Southeast, comprehensive medical centers, smaller regional facilities, private surgical groups that might not run the background checks quite as thoroughly. All 17 rejected him within 48 hours. His legal fees climbed towards 6 figures. His malpractice insurance carrier dropped him with a letter that read like a death certificate. By the second week, former colleagues weren't returning his calls. The restaurant where the surgical staff traditionally celebrated new hires stopped inviting him. The Department of Defense inquiry revealed the detail that sealed everything. He'd specifically reassigned Elena away from the ICU precisely to prevent her from accessing the general. He'd locked the trauma room door. He'd ensured that no one could intervene before he arrived. He wanted to be the surgeon who managed the tragedy, the man who demonstrated composure and wisdom in the face of impossible odds. He wanted the commendation. He wanted the department chair at a university hospital. He wanted to be the hero. Instead, he was becoming the punchline, the arrogant surgeon who let his ego nearly cost the life of a 4-star officer, and would have succeeded if not for a floor nurse with the courage to break protocol. The general survived. 3 more surgeries at Walter Reed, months of physical rehabilitation, the slow reconstruction of a body that had been systematically destroyed. Before he transferred out of Sacred Heart, before the helicopter came to take him to the military medical center in Maryland, he asked to see her. The request came through the unit secretary, official and quiet. Elena stood in the doorway of his hospital room at 1700 hours on a Wednesday, and the man in the bed opened his eyes, alert despite the intubation tube, aware despite the morphine, present in a way that suggested some part of him had never actually lost consciousness. He gestured for a pen. She handed him one from her pocket, the same pen she'd used to document 1,000 patient assessments, 1,000 vital signs, 1,000 small moments of survival. He wrote on the notepad the hospital had left by the bed, "You saved me twice." She realized then that he remembered. Not just the medevac. Marjah. The collapse building in the Jolin district. Her voice cutting through the dust and the chaos telling him to stay awake, to keep breathing, that help was coming. She'd been 24 years old. He'd been 8. The distance between them now felt like it contained an entire lifetime of secrets. He wrote again, his handwriting shaky but legible, or the patch. "You kept it." She nodded, and for the first time in 18 years, someone knew. He wrote one final sentence, "Thank you, Senior Chief." The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's mechanical whisper, the steady beep of the cardiac monitor, the simple sound of two people acknowledging what they'd survived. 2 months later, Elena's hospital badge read Director of Trauma Services. The promotion came with back pay, an apology from the board in writing, and a subtle understanding that Sacred Heart had nearly destroyed one of the finest trauma nurses on the East Coast because they'd allowed a single surgeon's arrogance to operate unchecked. She'd earned the position through skill and sacrifice, but she'd also earned it because a 4-star general had made one phone call and asked a very specific question: "Where is Senior Chief Martinez?" The general had recovered. He was mobile. He could attend the Veterans Fundraiser that Sacred Heart hosted in October, could stand on a stage in the auditorium, could tell the assembled crowd about the 2 moments when a nurse had saved his life, once in the dust and chaos of Marjah, and once in a locked trauma room at 0200 hours when every other door had closed. Dr. Hargrove watched the speech on YouTube from a studio apartment in Macon, Georgia, the kind of place where the walls were thin and the rent was low and the future stretched out ahead like a highway that only went downward. His medical career had ended not with a bang but with a series of small humiliations, the license suspension turning into revocation, the malpractice insurance gone, the hospital positions all saying the same thing in different ways: "We cannot in good conscience employ you." He'd burned through his savings on legal fees. He'd burned through his marriage trying to explain decisions that couldn't be explained. He'd burned through his reputation with a single act of arrogance, believing that his title would protect him, that his authority would shield him, that the institutional power he'd accumulated would be enough to destroy one floor nurse's credibility. He'd been wrong about every single thing. Now he sold supplemental health insurance from a folding table outside grocery stores, his voice the consistency of gravel, his smile the kind that made people uncomfortable. He closed the laptop and didn't open it again. 6 months after Elena had locked that trauma room door and changed the trajectory of multiple lives, she walked past a grocery store on Victory Drive in Savannah. The afternoon was bright and warm, the kind of Georgia day that made everything feel possible. She didn't see him at first. Then her peripheral vision caught the folding table, the hand-printed sign, the man in the wrinkled shirt arranging brochures with the mechanical precision of someone who'd performed the same task 1,000 times. Their eyes met across the parking lot for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough to register. Long enough to understand what the fall from grace looked like. Long enough for Elena to nod once, not in triumph, not in mockery, just acknowledgement that everyone paid for their choices eventually. She walked past without a word, her hospital badge swinging from its lanyard, Director of Trauma Services. Her office at Sacred Heart now held 2 items on the wall beside her medical certifications: a framed thank you letter from a 4-star general, handwritten in steady script, words of gratitude that would outlast careers and reputations. And beside it, a photograph in a simple frame, an 8-year-old boy with dust on his face and hope in his eyes, a child pulled from rubble by a young Navy sailor who'd kept him breathing through a sandstorm, who'd kept her promise that he'd make it home. He had. They both had. And every scar, every night she'd woken up screaming, Every year she'd spent running from her own identity, it had all led to this moment. A moment where the past and present collided in the space of one decision, one locked door, one nurse who refused to let anyone die on her watch. Subscribe for more stories of the people whose quiet courage changes everything. Like this video if you believe the ones who've seen the worst are often the ones who give the most. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? And follow, because these stories, the ones where heroes walk among us in scrubs and stethoscopes, they deserve to be told.